Well, in my second part of my gadgets and gizmos, I think I included this old heap-in frame. It's a number 2 fly press. It's been radically cleaned up, but you wouldn't know it. A lot of the staining on this bench here was the ferric chloride spill I mentioned. Caused a lot of corrosion. Anyway, number 2 fly press, an assortment down here if they're in frame, which I think they are. A number of pieces made specifically. Let's just pull that up. Here we are. That gives me space there. There's a block with holes in which I've used for punching parts occasionally, and there's just a piece of solid in there at the moment to act as a pressing piece. Now it's adjusted a bit tight at the moment. In a normal course of events, if you let go, it'll come down on its own real hard. But this is most useful to me for pressing operations and punching out small pieces. I haven't found all the relevant bits that I need yet. So anyway, there you are. It's not cleaned up fully. It needs a coat of paint, but it's too darn heavy to take off the bench. Amongst the last things that I'm covering in my trip through the gadget kingdom, I showed this before. We're just talking now about faceplates. This was a special one that I made up, and to show the thread, this is a close-up look of the thread on the end of the lathe spindle. Coarse square thread, and this particular block was made for some purpose. I think it was to go in a chuck and effectively extend the spindle. Anyway, that gives you an idea of that square thread. On the same subject, if I didn't show this piece before, and I may have done, there is, get some light in it, that's the difficult thing. That's a boss which is turned down to be threaded internally to go on the spindle, and then this end here has been turned down to a thread that suited the spindle of my old Myford 3.5 inch lathe. That lathe featured in my introductory videos, if I remember rightly. But the reason for showing that is the object of the exercise was to be able to use, I can't find what I'm looking for, was to be able to use other things. Another faceplate which I've forgotten I'd made was this one. It's been cleaned up a bit, so it actually looks quite shiny. However, the thread on the back, you can see it's much smaller than my main lathe spindle square thread, just about. So that's where this fella comes in, because I kept this faceplate. So if I start that in there, despite looking a bit large and clumsy, is another faceplate that I can put on the large 5.5 inch spindle. It's got enough holes in to be useful, and if I take that out of there, put this one to one side, then we have this one, which I think is a 10 inch, correction, 9 inch. Now this was off, this actually was made for a Myford small lathe. It's a lovely faceplate, full of slots and holes, well, slots. So this one again makes good use of my adapter. So there you go, a little bit of versatility. So now this handsome faceplate can go onto the spindle of my 5.5 inch Little John lathe. I don't use a faceplate very often, but by golly, when you've got something awkward and you really need to get it positioned and set up, faceplate's invaluable, particularly if you remember to use balance weights. Oh, I forgot one other thing. This is just a plain piece actually, which that was done for some purpose to go in that thread, but what was more important is this. It's a number 2 Morse, and I used to use that in here because the Myford had a number 2 on the Morse on the spindle. However, by putting that into a 2 to 4 adapter, I can actually put it straight into the spindle. So I actually have 2 options with that. Again, a means of setting it up for use. Now, more or less in conclusion here, just a short word about vices. I did take some footage of the vise that's underneath this table here. If I can find that clip, I'll slot it in. This old vise, I got this many years ago. As I say, my machining history goes back a long way. Anyway, this old vise, I forget where I even got it, but it's a useful piece because it's steel, and this anvil area here, you can work on that quite safely. But the nice thing about this vise is it's got 2 sets of jaws. These are slightly concave, very useful for holding anything that's a little bit rounded. Normally, however, it's in this situation. I'm just looking for the index mark. There. Lock that up. And then again, years ago, I made this little table. It doesn't look much, just a piece of angle and a sheet of plate. But I find I do a huge amount of work on there because every other flat surface gets covered in stuff. So for the purpose of showing some detail on various things, this is basically where I'm going to operate. Just an afterthought here. Not very exciting, but there are numerous occasions when you want to protect something. That simple aluminum jaw softenings, those are even more basic. And oh, there we go. And these go on the other side on the curved jaws. And then these, which need sticking together again. God, these are old. And that's got leather. And somewhere I did make some lead softenings, but anyway, these leather ones have proved very useful to try and avoid damaging work. But as far as these go, you can never have enough vices for one reason or another. Size, type of jaws. Now, initially this one is a very basic cast piece. When I got it, it was incomplete. This was achieved by brazing a nut onto this bridge section, and the lead screws just turned up out of some round, fairly straightforward jaws. Terrible light again, but the rear jaw has a V in it, which is very useful. This one is what some people call a piece of cheap import junk. It was made in Taiwan or whatever. It was very inexpensive. A little bit of work on it made a lot of difference, and that gets used as much as anything. Because it's quite heavy, it'll sit on the drill press table without fixing it down. If you're drilling small stuff, it just gives you a bit of security. And that's got a couple of pieces of aluminum with leather on, just for softing. And this one, this is a big old vise of fairly good quality, absolutely solid as anything, and I fitted it onto this base plate as much as anything to make it versatile. So there we are. If that won't fix to a surface with one hole or slot or another, I've got a problem. It's quite heavy, very useful on occasions. And then small stuff, this little vise here, if we can see anything about it. I got to get my hand out of the way. This has a swivel on the active jaw, which makes it fairly good for something which isn't quite parallel. Very small, couple of mounting slots, and this one, along with this, which is actually also a cheap import, but one which I fixed onto a base plate with slots, and that, or the other one, will go quite nicely on the small vertical slide. Not something I use that often, but I have actually had this mounted on here with considerable success. It takes a while to set up, but it's a good little vise. So there we are, vices. They're not just bad things people do. They hold work. Well, finally, in closing, not that it's that important, you can buy cheap and cheerful bases to mount your micrometer, but this was a very early thing I made. I think, unlike most of my stuff, it hasn't even got a date, but it's probably about 25 years ago. Very simple, but it's nice and heavy, and that was the intention. Made out of a big chunk, and it sits on top of my lathe headstock most of the time. And in conclusion, or final conclusion again, this is what you might recognize as a tap wrench. It's particularly big. It was one of the many things that were rusted to blazes from ferric chloride exposure, and it's had a bit of a clean up. And this actually is a number 7 made by GT&D Corporation. There you are, I couldn't read it at first. GT&G Corporation, Greenfield, Massachusetts. Made in USA. Quite a rare animal these days. Lovely old tap wrench. That's about it until I find any more odds and ends, bits and pieces, gizmos and gadgets.